Okay, well, you guys ready to get started?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, so I'm gonna pull up and just get some questions ready here, and we can just address them. I thought I could be, just kind of the guy that reads the questions, and since both of you are way smarter than I am, you could be the people that that have responses to the questions. Is that a good format for you guys?
That works for me.
Okay. All right. Fantastic.
Hey, Marie, there's one for certain that I know has got to be up your alley and not mine. Somebody brought up Donald Trump and
John Adams.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
I know John Adams is rolling in his grave right now. He did not.
Yeah, but it was like
Yeah, no.
not part of my wheelhouse, let's put it that way.
What, the Alien and Sedition Acts, you think, is that what he's referring to?
The only thing I could think that he may be referring to is the one-term president thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Adams did a lot of stuff in that between him getting elected and then that next election with Jefferson, that they called that next election the Revolution of 1800.
Right, because he stepped down peacefully. It was the first transfer of power.
Yeah.
No, Adams was very qualified for the position. Well, we can answer it when we get there, but okay. I didn't.
Cool. Well, I'll just move in order, and we'll get rolling. So, all right. So I'll introduce you guys. Marie, you're back on the show. Thank you for always being willing to come on. It's always awesome talking to you. I always learn a lot, I feel like, and get book suggestions, and you email me your syllabus and all sorts of stuff. So thank you for always being willing to come on. Housenick, also, you've been on several times. You've been on enough times. We're just going to start doing Politics Unraveled every few months. So if you ever want to collaborate with any of that, Marie, I really appreciate you just having the idea to do this. So,
oh yeah.
All right. Well, let's start with, I posted on social media for the podcast page some questions, polling people. I got a lot of responses this morning, but let's start with Nathan George yesterday. He's a local guy here in Russellville. I think does he live in Russellville or Dardanelle now? I think he might. He's from over in Yale County, but he's served on the Russellville City Council. He's integral in helping a lot of small businesses. He owns a small business. So I always, and he's been on the podcast. I always like talking with Nathan. He said this: has there ever been a national election overturned after a recount?
Not in the modern era.
Definitely not in the modern era. And I think, that's a big part of it. When we talk about the modern presidency and political science anyway, we're talking everybody after FDR. Mm-hmm. Roosevelt's the cut. If you start comparing some of the early American presidents to the current, it's apples. It's not even apples and oranges. It's like apples and steak. Right. But no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and we'll get to this later because I believe that this was in the questions, but something I wanted to hit on today is how everybody keeps bringing, and again, we'll get to it because there's at least one question about, but the 2000 election, that's something that keeps coming up.
Okay. Do you want me to expand on the simple no answer?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
All right. So 2000 was weird, and you can't compare it to today. If Donald Trump wants to win the presidency, he has to win multiple states simultaneously. He lost the Electoral College pretty badly. I think it's,
306 to 232.
Yes, he needs at least 3 states to go his way of all these lawsuits. In the 2000 election, it was literally one state was the dividing line. It was Florida.
Yeah, less than like 500 votes, right?
1,500 or 5,000 in a state with I think it was 7 or 8 million votes cast. I mean, it was really, really, 0.1%. But what happened in Florida, why it was so controversial. So we're not even going to talk about exit polling and election night. So they counted up all the votes the first time. And I think Bush won by 5,000. Then they had their automatic recount triggered, which, oh, my camera, no touching the desk. Then
cool.
They had their automatic triggered recount. Then Bush only won by like 1,500, so something is up. Then they went into a process going for a third count. And that is when the lawsuits started. Basically, Florida was using punch card ballots. And every time you run a punch card through a machine, it's going to wriggle some of those punch cards. This is where you get into, if you want to really feel old, they brought up hanging chads, swinging chads, dimpled chads. But they were creating new election law after the election was over. That was the elemental problem of 2000. That's when lawsuits started, and that is where the Supreme Court stepped in and said, you can't really do this third count by hand with these new rules that you just created. And that's where Bush 43 W was declared the victor, and Al Gore conceded the election. Right now, we are still in all these states who are where these possible lawsuits are still existing. They're still doing their constitutional duty. They don't have, I looked it up, they don't have to tell you who won for a couple more weeks yet. Basically, the state's got to figure it out by about the end of November. Counts, recounts, that sort of stuff. And part of these lawsuits is they got to show that it would change the outcome. That is one of the big things that they're running into. Let me find something like, oh, here's a good example. Michigan. A lot of their lawsuits have been thrown out. They're done. Why? Because Biden won Michigan by 150,000 votes. A lawyer has to show that this malfeasance would change the outcome. Now, Florida, 2,000, 1,500 votes, 5,000 votes. It's pretty easy to get your foot in the door as a lawyer. But in Michigan, with 150,000 votes, you're talking a massive conspiracy with like 10% of the state on your side. That's why they've dismissed the cases. There's no way to sue and change that outcome.
Right.
So.
And I looked this morning, so you can look at democracydocket.com and follow along with these cases in real time. And I checked this morning. So far, there have been 32 post-election cases in 6 states. There are 12 active cases, and 20 cases have either been won by the Democratic Party or dismissed outright. And so that's what the state of the lawsuits look like at this point. And exactly right. You have to prove that you can overturn the results of an election. And we're talking about margins at least in the tens of thousands, and then in Michigan in over 100,000. And so we've never seen even local races overturned with margins like that.
Yeah. And I think we have a couple other questions that will eventually tie into that. Did you have any sort of organization on? I know that you looked at a lot of these questions previously. I tagged both you guys in the post where most of them came in. Is there anything we want to elaborate on before we move on from here?
No, I would say if we could, let's talk about the election itself and then talk about maybe some of the ancillary stuff. Like somebody asked about polling, places to find political information. That's like the ancillary, the extra stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That to me should be at the end. We'll, wrap that up near the end. But no, there was, a lot of good questions, a lot of smart questions. Some blast from the past, I have to say.
Yeah, totally. One other thing Nathan was inquiring about is, and I think he was joking, or I mean, maybe he wasn't, is he said, what's the over under on Pelosi being the next president?
Yeah.
0, I think.
Yeah.
That's why I was like, I guess
a lot of things would have to happen before that happen. I mean, she's still Speaker of the House. She's in line for the presidency, but a lot of things would have to go wrong before that happened.
Yeah.
Yes.
So not quite 0, but pretty close.
She'd have to poison the president and vice president and get away with it.
Maybe not her. She wouldn't have to do that, but something would have to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking house.
During a pandemic, I mean, weird stuff has happened all year. And like, I mean, just I saw this morning. I didn't look into it, but I saw some sort of article saying that 130 Secret Service people have COVID, or maybe that was a stat that they had COVID. It was something.
I think currently are in quarantine.
Wow,
is what that article said.
Yeah.
Wow, amazing. Okay, so this one's from Evelyn. So with everything that's happened in the last 4 years, with a president with no political background, my question is, will they start putting or adding stricter requirements on who can be the president? My other question is in the Constitution. It states that there should be separation of church and state. So we'll do the church and state one in a minute, because a bunch of people commented underneath that one. So presidential requirements. What do you guys think about that?
Well, historically, that's a slippery slope. We've had literacy tests at certain points in our, in order to register to vote, and that is used to discriminate against people of color.
Yeah,
that
great
was
point.
true of Jim Crow South. So I think that having that kind of, where do you draw the line? Can it go too far? Absolutely. Is it a problem when people are elected to office who don't have political experience? It absolutely can be.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that instituting some kind of test or some kind of rule it hasn't worked out before in American history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And part of the problem is, like, with requirements, you don't want political amateur night, but you also want to avoid career politicians. The last topic was Nancy Pelosi. Both parties have them, but when you've been in the system for so long, everybody does kind of start thinking the same way. It is good. The dog behind me is seeing something. But the issue is you get kind of this group mindset, that group think. Bringing in outsiders with new ideas can be really good, but if you wind up, it's trying to find a balance. You don't want complete and total political amateurs, but you don't want people so entrenched they've been doing the same thing for like 70 years. And like Marie said, it is a slippery slope when you start having litmus test requirements. And that would be true of either political party.
Right.
What are the current requirements, if you know them? And I can pull them up if not, but I know that there are age and what part of geography you were born on and stuff like that requirements. But you want to overview those? Yeah.
So 35 years old, a natural born citizen.
Huh. Yeah, that's it. That's rush hour.
It. Okay. Yeah. So. That is, I'm totally with you. Like, I was thinking slippery slope before you said it. I was like, because that's it. That's the same exact reason. History has shown us in the past that, in relation to voting and requirements for that, that's a good comparison. Okay. So church and state, how are there certain politicians that are able to block laws or fight them because of their religious belief? Isn't that blurring the line between church and state? Somebody went on to add, just here in our local community, like when we had the cannabis dispensary debate, it was a debate on zoning, and then at the meeting, sort of religious views came up as the reason why the zoning permit was being denied. So I asked for some specific examples of what she was referring to. She says abortions, LGBTQ community, overturning Roe v. Wade, etc.
With those cases, when those are tried before the Supreme Court doesn't look at religion as a reason to overturn those cases. They look at how the law is being applied, how they're arguing, is this necessary? How is marriage defined at certain levels? For example, in the marriage equality case. But religion isn't the only thing that's used. Now, people may make those arguments in the public, but that's not what's being used to actually, or would be used to actually overturn these things at the level that they would be overturned. So people can make that argument, but that's not what's happening at the level it needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those cases really, Marie hit it on the head. They don't, yes, people bring in religious lines of discussion, but the law is often on against them. Like the case is Oberfeld v. Hodges. That is the gay marriage case in the United States. Everybody's like religion, religion, religion. If you read the decision, it wasn't about religion. It was about economics. Basically, it said the U.S. law differentiating marriage economically disadvantaged same-sex couples. You know, you have to pay more in taxes. You don't get all these financial benefits. The religion angle doesn't play out. But I think the trouble is people will bring it into politics until they're sued over it. You know, like the example you brought up is another good one. You know, once they found, you know, we're gonna fight this all the way to the Arkansas State Supreme Court, and then you find out, well, the law's not on your side. It's going to cost you $100,000, and because all of you spouted your religious views and not position views, there's no way. I think it was the Russellville city attorney said, "There's no way I can win this case." Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it was still about, yes, they allowed religion to color it, but it was an economic argument. You know,
and religion obviously is used by politicians and by voters to gain voters, and that's been true throughout the history of this country.
Well, and I think that is probably a lot of what spurned that question. If you think about the last year and photo opportunities that took place during the protest in DC, and just how much that demographic was supporting the president.
Right. And the moral majority and evangelical Christians have been an important part of conservative voters since at least 1979, when the moral majority was formed. And they just got more powerful during the 1980s. So they remain an important voting bloc for conservative Republican politicians. They remain, they take on an advisory role to conservative presidents. But when it comes to the law, that's still separated.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking as well is, I mean, I look at religions and I say, okay, this religion has morals and ethics, and, you know, let's see what they are, how present they are, how they're dealing with certain things. But in philosophy, you don't really look at, I don't really equate. I've had 2 ethics courses and 27 hours philosophy to undergraduate. That's when I kind of stopped equating morals and ethics with religion, you know?
Right. That's completely separate. Mm-hmm. Non-religious people are and can be moral.
Definitely. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think too, and there was a Netflix thing that came out about this. I didn't finish watching it, but you know, you see things like the White House, I think it's the prayer breakfast that they have every year, and some things like that for that demographic. It really makes it seem like there might not be as much of a separation. And like I said, I didn't finish I think that Netflix show is called The Family or something like that, but it went into some of the history of that and like the group that's behind leading it. And it was thought provoking and concerning to me a bit, but anyway. Okay. We're to the John Adams, Donald Trump. What are our similarities there for Matt Frazier?
Well, I would like to know where that question came from. I would like to know what made him ask that question. But John Adams was a very intelligent, very educated founder of this country, helped write the Constitution. He was only a one-term president, so maybe that's the similarity. But as far as that, no. John Adams was certainly not a populist of any kind, which many people think Trump is. So,
yeah, Yeah. And you kind of hit on this, and I mentioned as well earlier before we started recording, is that it's a one-term presidency, and that election of 1800 is often termed, or at least it's actually more. Thomas Jefferson is who named it.
Yeah.
He called it the revolution. He said it was the second American Revolution.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is a big deal. That is a big deal. So that's the first time in American history that we have a peaceful transfer of power. So before 1800, there were never really contested elections. And so Adams and Jefferson have gone through this terrible election in the election of 1800. They both say if the other's elected, this will be the end of the world in a way, and the new experiment will die. Well, they come out of the election, Jefferson wins. And what we see is that Adams hands over power peacefully. There's a peaceful transfer of power. So this is a real test of our Constitution, and we passed that test. And so I do think it is a revolution of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that's an important election. But that was a peaceful transfer of power. John Adams, conceded. So I don't know that that election is important, but I don't think there's similarities there.
Let me tie that. Go ahead, Housenick. Go ahead.
I teach a lot of world politics, and that is one of the things you look for in a foreign country or any country to call them truly democratic. When does somebody actually lose a free and fair election and peacefully hand over power? There's a lot of countries which kind of sort of, if you squint one eye really hard, look democratic. But until they are able to hand off power peacefully, you really can't call them truly democratic. Not in the same way as you do in, say, Western European, American democracy models, for sure.
Yeah. Well, while we're back in that era, even though we kind of also mentioned earlier, we're really looking for comparisons sort of post-World War II, post-FDR to present for it to be more relevant to the conversation. But we did have another question from...
Well, I got one that might blow your mind.
Go ahead.
Should we compare Donald Trump to Jimmy Carter?
Go on. What are you thinking?
Well, I think Donald Trump and Jimmy Carter, they're both one-term presidents. They're both in the modern era. The one I think of is Jimmy Carter and Donald Trump both hit problems that other presidents didn't have to deal with in the same way, especially the economy. Jimmy Carter had problems. They called it stagflation. Normally, unemployment and inflation move independently let me get it right again. They move in certain ways. Because of oil shocks and stuff like that, Jimmy Carter faced them both moving against him, basically. Unemployment goes up, inflation generally doesn't. And as in a lot of American politics, if you want to get reelected, it's the economy, stupid, is sort of the refrain you get. COVID-19 was definitely an economic problem for, Trump's reelection campaign. The economy, you had, people out of work, for the entire year. If January 2020, if you're just looking at his economic record, Trump's in a pretty good place. So I think there's a good paper for somebody. I want you to compare the presidency of Jimmy Carter versus Donald J. Trump. Really makes everybody's head spins.
Yeah.
You want to add anything to that, Marie?
I agree that would be an interesting.
That's a cool topic.
You don't think about that because the men themselves are so different. But if you look at the economic problems they both dealt with, I think Carter would have been too honest with the public, where we had the opposite problem in this election cycle, where there was information kept from us, and maybe Carter gave too much and Trump didn't give enough. But that's an interesting question.
Okay, so this one, and they threw a couple of questions out here all at once, but it's really this last question sort of ties into the previous one we did. Why do we have a two-party system? How do John McCain and Donald Trump end up in the same primary, or Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the same party? Didn't George Washington warn us about the power of political parties?
Yeah, and I saw you answered part of this question on Facebook, talking about Washington absolutely did warn of political parties and factionalism because he saw that develop in his own cabinet, and he saw some of that play out in the press at the time as well. But we don't really have the modern party system that we have today with party machinery until the 1830s, when Martin Van Buren builds the Democratic Party, which is the same Democratic Party that we have today, although completely different platform than the platform we have today, than the platform the Democratic Party has today. So it's at that point where you have this idea that you need two legitimate political parties to oppose one another in elections, and that develops the second party, or the two-party system that we know today in the 1830s. So the country is not born with that, certainly, with the idea of political parties, although there is factionalism around the founding. And then, so that's how we get the two-party system. What was the other part of that question?
Let's see. They were, I guess, like, how do John McCain and Donald Trump end up in the same primary, or Biden and Harris in the same party?
Part of it is it's a lack of options. I think the reality is with a two-party system, if you look, the American political experience, now other countries will be different, but being in a third party in the US, you're just kind of like a painful afterthought too many times. If you go back, it was 1992. H. Ross Perot runs. There we go. I got the name. He got the most votes of any third party in the modern era. I think he got in the teens. I need my PowerPoints in front of me, but he won exactly 0 electoral college votes. Ralph Nader running in 2000, I think he had 10,000 votes in Florida. If he's not on the ballot, we might have had President Al Gore. In 2016, we did the math. There was about 4.5% third parties in 2016. The Green Party alone, which is, a very liberal wing, this is where I could totally see your Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and your Bernie Sanders wing of the Democrats would be Greens in the American. They voted enough for their Green candidate, not for Hillary Clinton. They were literally the margin of difference for Donald Trump winning those states he did and winning the presidency. So what does this tell Americans? Well, if Perot, if I vote third party, I'm not going to win because I still have to overcome the Electoral College. And if I vote third party in the wrong place at the wrong time, you wind up with different results. So both parties agree on one thing: keep it a two-party system. Let's keep the third parties down, oppressed, limited. But it's, again, a lot of Americans see that same, what's the use of splintering off, creating your own party, something like that. There's enough modern election examples. You're going to lose. And you may actually help your opponent win.
Yeah. Now, throughout American history, third parties have had, especially before 1900, third parties have had opportunities, especially at the state and local level, even the congressional level, to win seats and to change policy and to change the parties. So the Free Soil Party in the 1850s, they were gaining seats. The Know Nothings in New England in the 1800s had seats at the local and state and even the congressional level where they can change policy. And so in the 1850s, when the Republican Party is born, the Republican Party takes in different groups of people under this banner party. And so you have a lot of different ideas within a single party. And after the Civil War, as these two parties are solidified as the two main parties, then you begin to see this idea where third parties are not going to work. The populists try it in the 1890s, and they can never make inroads. So they start to fuse their candidates with one of the two major parties. And so you do have these large, just these varied ideologies under the same party tense because of the system that where it's really one of two choices. And so that's why primary elections matter, because if you want to push if you want to put your ideology within the party front and center, then you need to vote for that person in the primary election.
And hey, Marie, I'm spacing out on this. What was the so Democratic Party was split in 1860s, Republicans. What was the third party? It was made up of a bunch of old know-nothings, and it was like an amalgamated party, like what you're saying. That
Whigs.
The Whigs, was that the Whigs in that
yeah.
election? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, they died. The Whig Party kind of is enveloped by the Republican Party in the 1860 election, because by then they're
Okay.
I need my PowerPoints in front of me. I can remember that 1850s, there were 5 parties that basically rolled into the U.S. Civil War. The Grand Old Party was one of them. That was the rebranded Corrupt Bargain Party, if I can remember correctly. But I can't remember names. But I know there was one. The
Liberty Union Party, the Whigs, the Know Nothings, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party.
Yeah.
I just heard the Black lecturing on this the other day, because I've been listening to a bunch of his old lectures and things, because we just did Civil War and Arkansas history. So, yeah. Okay. All right. Now this next one, and if any of this is some stuff that you want to save to the end, so we're getting to some of those questions we talked about before we began. Abby, she had a lot of really great questions. And these are things that too, like I've chased down some of these by state, and I will say this: I have done podcasts where I was like still trying to figure things out before this that I will probably publish after this. So, but it has been like I've been hours trying to chase down some of these things myself. So I'm interested to hear your take. What are the lawsuits filed by the Trump administration? Many of them have been tossed out. I think 12 or something today I saw. And can that change the overall outcome of the election?
So again, you can follow along with these lawsuits live at democracydocket.com.
Okay.
So if this can change, this will change after this podcast is over. So democracydocket.com, and you can follow along with all of this. So there were 32 cases in 6 states. There are only 12 active cases at this point.
Okay, that's what I was saying.
And there are 20 cases that have been thrown out or ruled in favor of the Democratic Party. Yeah. And these are a wide range of issues that are that these cases cover a wide range of issues. Some are quite on Democracy Docket. You can read some of the affidavits in the cases, and it's fun.
Yeah.
It's fun.
You want to add anything to that, Chris?
No, I think that covers a lot of it. What you're finding is a pattern. They're filing these lawsuits, and to file the lawsuits like doing a short paper. But what's happening is when you have to get up there in front of it and you have to argue in front of a judge as a lawyer, I think one of the things they've run into as a theme for these cases they've lost is it's one thing for an individual to say, I saw X, Y, or Z, and it'd be a fabrication. If that, the biggest one is there is a Pennsylvania postal employee or postal inspector who says he witnessed people throwing hundreds of votes in the trash or whatever. He signed an affidavit to it. A couple of days ago, he recanted that affidavit, and he committed perjury.
Yeah.
So he is now going to be a felon. Yeah. The thing. Now, here's the thing. That one incident is where a lot of this social media frenzy's been stirred up from. But here's the thing. You're a postal inspector. You committed this crime. Yes, you're probably going to get probation. You're going to be fined a lot of money. If you commit perjury and you are a practicing attorney, your career is over. Mm-hmm. You lose your license to practice law. Because that's what's happening is once these lawyers get into the courtrooms, they cannot their arguments are falling apart. Like I think it was the Pennsylvania one. They'd argued that no, there was no, the affidavit said there was no Republicans anywhere in the counting locations. And I forget what the weird euphemism was. I can see Marie smiling. So I think she's run across it. Like, no, there was a non-zero number of Republicans present.
Yes, a non-zero number.
Yes. And it was like, it's one of those things. The lawyers, we are an evidence-based legal system. And just, putting out the accusation and affidavit is only the start of the process. But you've got to be able to show real evidence and real harm. And that's where it's falling apart. That's where you're basically, 1 for 20 and you're batting 5%. And that's where a lot of these cases, I think over the next week, you're going to see it. I would not be surprised if it might be like 30-2.
Yeah.
And it'll run its legal course.
Yeah.
So one thing I kept running into in just trying to break it down in some of these states that everyone is bringing up, and just seeing what was being said and seeing what the issues were. And this, I think, will tie into our next question, well, about just like overall how elections are handled, right? So let's see. So one, are the state laws varying, causing any of this confusion? That's what I'm thinking, right? And that's what I'm running across. Well, you guys, could you say anything on that?
Well, each state is responsible for how it conducts its own elections. Okay. So each state law is different. So my students have asked about this all week this week. Why did it take Florida no time at all? Like, we knew the results in Florida on election night. Why do we still not know all of the results in Pennsylvania, which was earlier this week? And my answer is that Florida, because of what happened in 2000, changed the way it counts votes. And so they were counting their mail-in ballots as they came in, so they could dump all of those votes on election night. Pennsylvania, you had two options of how to vote in Pennsylvania. You could either vote same day in person, or you could do a mail-in ballot. They didn't have in-person early voting the way we have here. And so when those and the Pennsylvania state legislature, which has a Republican majority, passed a law that said that those mail-in ballots could not be counted until election day. So you have millions of mail-in ballots, and you cannot start counting those until election day itself. So obviously that's going to take some time. And so that's one of the reasons and Americans don't know that, because why would most Americans need to know that election? I mean, it's different state to state. It would certainly have helped in this instance, but most Americans don't know that. So it looks suspicious. It looks confusing, but it's just state to state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a good example that's exactly right. And a good example for a state that for some reason, nobody complained about was North Carolina.
Right.
North Carolina has a huge military population. So they're getting votes from across literally the globe. Right. But as basically, I don't even know if they have certified their election. Everybody's assuming Donald Trump has won, but they're counting votes slower than Nevada was. And it is a state by state. To really understand a presidential election, you got to get off the national stage. You got to really get nerdy and dig into all 50 states and figure out, what goes on within them, whether it is who won, who lost, how they count votes, voting procedures, etc.
Right. And North Carolina is a great example because they allow mail-in ballots within 9 days after the election. So if those ballots come in 9 days after the election, they will still count them. And you're absolutely right. Nobody complained about North Carolina because they said on election night, we're not going to count any more for a period of time. So you don't even need to look at us to see when these vote drops are going to come. Whereas Pennsylvania was saying it's going to be, we're going to drop 100,000 here or a couple thousand here. And so it was really easy for the media to keep up with that and make it exciting over time. And I watched election week, which is what it became. Yeah. And it was, you were down to like, when are these next 5,000 votes going to come out of Allegheny County in Pennsylvania? And the media really played that up, or Maricopa County in Arizona. And so it's just, and people don't even look at North Carolina because the media is not talking about it. And it's we have to be honest here. It's the Republican Party saying that the mail-in votes are a problem. And if they think they're going to win North Carolina, they're not going to complain about North Carolina.
Yeah. To expand on Pennsylvania, I'm originally from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is weird because it is, I think it may be the last old school voting state. In normal times, there is no early voting. There is almost no mail-in voting in Pennsylvania. So almost everything is done election day. And that is, for a normal election and practice, fine, great. But what happened with COVID, they basically made up a lot of rules. I forget what ridiculous number of mail-in votes. There was millions of votes that were suddenly cast through the mail, and they just, we joked about it. They're the student. When's your paper due? 8 p.m. Tuesday. I'm going to start Wednesday morning on, the second half of it.
Yeah, exactly.
But like Marie said, that's what the state legislature decide. We're gonna just worry about election day, and then starting at 9 a.m. Wednesday morning, we're going to start counting. And I think locally, one of the things Cora, Brian's wife, showed, I think a lot of Arkansans don't recognize the sheer size of some of these voting areas.
Right.
The two counties everybody was looking at in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia County and Chester County, those two counties cast as many votes as all of Arkansas. And that, all of a sudden, like, I think the one Cora threw up was Los Angeles County.
Yeah.
With you have 10 million registered voters in one county, which would be, all of Arkansas, Oklahoma. And let's skim off a little bit of Tennessee for good measure. But it's like, this takes time. You have to open envelopes. You have to do, if Pennsylvania were wiser, they should have started counting those things a lot earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Just count them as you get them. But they decided to wait till after. So that's when you find out, like Saturday morning, that they're finally done. They're going to call it.
Right.
So here's one thing that I keep seeing, and we actually had, and it was reported, and I followed up on it, and they said in our community, there was an issue with an electronic machine that was being voted on here in Polk County. And I saw some people buzzing about it. I looked into it. They said, hey, it was just an issue with this one machine. We removed it. That has been something that is also being brought up, is that there's voter fraud in the electronic voting and the computer systems and everything. And again, it's one side saying that. Is that all been unsubstantiated? Because I was chasing it down. And
yes.
I got over it after chasing it down, right? So
there's nothing there. There's nothing there.
Was that Pennsylvania that was in debate on that one as well, or Michigan? I can't.
A lot of people have brought it up. If you want to fix, let's go. You got two things. First is voter impersonation fraud. That is the dumbest ass way to try and swing an election. Because I put it to you this way, McMillan helped me out with this a little bit. Do you realize how many felonies you got to commit to make that actually work? I did at one point. One of the other professors at Arkansas Tech, Dr. Ernie Enchelmeyer down in English, he is one of the
JPs.
Yeah. Good guy. When he won his race, he won it by like 25 votes to get elected. And I use that as a case to get, in order to fix the election so he loses, I would need to commit like 52 or 53 different felonies. Because one, you got to break into the county courthouse and you got to steal the voter records. You need them all. I need to find people who are registered to vote, who never show up to vote, and probably never will. Then I need to make, let's see, if I need 25 people, I need 25 fake IDs. So I need to forge 25 Arkansas driver's licenses. That will cost you money too. What is the going rate for a fake ID? If you want an awkward question, ask your students that. So, all right, now I've made 25 fake IDs for 25 people. I hand those people those IDs, they go to vote. They're impersonating somebody else. They're going to have to know the information on it. They're going to have to remember the information and not get caught. So at every step and every one of those is a felony. You know, it's like a D-class felony. It's lower. It's not violent. But it's like to fix a justice of the peace election, I need to commit 52 felonies for one of 15 seats in Pope County elections.
Right. Right.
That's the dumbest thing I have ever heard. That's like the worst Ocean's movie ever. But now you can't do that on a statewide basis. It's just a conspiracy of 100,000 people. It's just not going to work. Now the voting machines, this is why voting machines, it's even a local decision. Elections are local. The federal government, somebody brought it up, will we ever have federal run elections? No. The federal government puts out guidelines, like after 2000, they said electronic voting, please. The state will put out guidelines, but at the end of the day, it's up to your local elections. Your county will figure it out. And I will say Pope County, it worked really well. They had a lot of people. It was safe, plexiglass galore. But like you said, it's like think about how many hundreds of thousands of voting machines there are out there. One may malfunction someday. And this is why it's actually good to have early voting. If, your voting machine breaks, or malfunctions the Tuesday before, you can pull it out, you can get it fixed, Control Alt Delete the voting machine, whatever you need to do, but you don't have that Pennsylvania approach where the whole state's going to punch 5 million people through their voting places in one day. That's the kind of push you're going to have, where you're going to have those kind of elections, just a way outsized influence if one machine breaks. Sorry, I went on a ramble there.
Hey, let me. So, do you have anything to add to that, Marie? Because I have a question, or see if you want you guys to take on something from the 2016 election involving this.
No, I think that was great. The only thing I would add is that there are also these claims about dead people voting.
That's what I was going to say.
The claims have been, I've seen so many news stories from people who are live and like, I have the same person's name, but my vote counts because I'm still alive. that they've, people have said that they're dead and voting. And so those have been dismissed too. But again, you have to prove that enough people are voting to overturn the election, like enough dead people are voting. And that's not, you may have a little bit of that every cycle, but that's not happening in any large numbers anywhere where it matters.
Yeah.
So I remember a political ad in like 2015 with Mike Huckabee, right? And he's standing outside. It's kind of snowing. Has his hands in his trench coat, and he's like, "I'm Mike Huckabee from Arkansas, and I always knew that when I was running against the Clintons, that as long as I could beat the people in the cemetery, I had a shot at winning." And I was just like, oh my gosh, this is like the craziest ad I've ever seen. But that was in the last election cycle.
But yeah, it's
the whole dead people voting isn't new.
Purging voting records, I think, is the term you will hear a lot. You have to go. It is up to the counties to go through their voting records. It's like every other boring maintenance. They have to figure out who's passed away, who's moved away. They will have rules for that. Like, if Brian Wilson moves to Memphis, if everything you need to do to move, notifying your voting board that you have moved is probably not on anybody's list. And they will realize, hey, after a couple of election cycles, hey, he used to vote and he is no longer voting. So at some point, they just remove you. You know, it may be 2 or 3 presidential cycles. That's come up. How often must they do it? What are the criteria they must do it? That one's usually a statewide decision, more statewide guidelines, but it's up to the locals to do it. Just sort of sitting there going through voting registration records.
Yeah, and even if you're registered to vote in 2 states, it's still illegal to vote in 2 states. You know, it's not your fault that you're registered in 2 states, because you have to be culled from those voting records or registers, but you still can't vote in 2 states. That's still a felony.
Yeah.
Do you guys think that we saw more of that this election and this is a point I saw brought up, and again, I would have to look into it, but I did see it brought up a couple of times that a lot of people did move from certain areas due to COVID. And I don't know if that's true, like people leaving states like California, New Jersey, and New York and moving. I don't know how much of that went on. I personally know people that left all of those states, but I don't know if it was a mass exodus or what. Enough for it to be something that's relevant to our conversation today.
I don't know about you. I know one person who had to struggle and kind of figure that out. With COVID and everybody getting scattered, his wife is in Indiana. Dr. Pearson.
Yeah.
So, you know, he is registered. His residential address is here in Arkansas. He, when the lockdowns and all hell broke loose in March, he packed up his laptop, grabbed as much of his stuff as he could. He's basically functionally been back in Indiana until recently. So, I mean, he spent 7 or 8 months of the year, but he came back down to Arkansas. He cast 1 vote and 1 vote only, like Marie said, in Arkansas. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's more of those cases, especially I could see that being a challenge. Like you bring up New York, New Jersey, those places where states come together with huge populations. I was thinking the Maryland, Washington, D.C., Virginia spot where you just have a lot of people. You know, I remember I lived in Maryland, I worked in D.C., and Virginia is like 5 miles away. So you wind up easily crossing multiple state lines. I wouldn't be surprised if it was more of a challenge in 2020 with COVID and all the remote working and remote learning and stuff like that. It would make sense that there may be an uptick, but I think a lot of it always has existed, you know. Mm-hmm. People will telecommute. You know, I think for years, my wife's work, we were sitting here in Arkansas, but her job technically was out of Maryland. You know, she telecommuted for 7 years, but she always, you know, she was an Arkansas resident. We just I think social media maybe makes us more aware that this stuff is going on, and it amplifies, like the postal inspector example. We know that because social media went, you know, goo goo gaga for it and blew it up everywhere. And I think that maybe there's sort of a megaphone effect.
Right.
Something that happens 2 or 3 times that may have probably happened in the 1880s. All of a sudden, you're going to hear about from, you know, sea to shining sea and on parlor message boards. Sorry, I got to throw
I was hoping it would come up.
Oh, yes.
All right. Go ahead, Marie.
I heard also, just glancing on Twitter, that people are concerned about Nevada. So they really care about the states where where the results come from, where the election is decided. And a lot of that, and a lot of that comes from military. So if you're stationed in a state and then you're moved from that state by the United States Army, your vote still counts in that state, depending on how long you've been gone. And so there's some of that, but again, there's always been that. So as long as you're just voting once, you're not. Yeah.
Okay, so I think this will kind of tie in. This is from Matt Patterman, Matt Pat. I've seen other countries vote in different ways. Some places ink their fingers and have single drop-in ballots. Some have stringent forms of ID necessary to vote, and some have very little. Some use computers and technology to get it done. In the experts' YouTube opinion, which way has the most integrity? Also, which country do you think does it best, has the most complete voting system? These are not really American election questions, but it would be interesting to hear your opinions on which way you would consider best.
Well, I teach a whole class called comparative government, where we look at different political systems, not just democracies, but we throw in your Chinas in there and stuff like that. I'm always reluctant to say somebody is best. Something is different. And politicians and people adjust to the system that they are presented. Like one of the ones that people bring out is like Australia. Australia has about like 90% voter turnout. Part of that is because Australia fines you if you don't vote. All of us, you want to balance the budget. Imagine you don't vote, fine. We're going to nail you for $400 or $500. Now, there is kind of a side note to this problem, though. They don't vote as often as Americans do. Basically, they're a parliamentary system. They vote once every 4 or 5 years. It's not like, I joke about it. If you live in Arkansas, I think my record is I've voted 5 times in one calendar year. Vote in a primary, vote in a primary runoff, vote in a general. There was a special election for school board, and this year we had a special election for a 1-cent tax. You could find people if you vote just, once every 4 years. Now, I will say electronic voting is almost global standard. They've been running electronic voting in places like Brazil, India, for Western Europe for decades. And it's the same thing. It's technology based. If you have early voting and you have time to diagnose problems, you can resolve a lot of it. So, there's no single, we've got what we've got. And part of it, I think as, you two historians would realize is we are different in some ways. We're huge geographically. If you were trying to run a national election on a country as large as the United States, it gets really difficult fast. You have to delegate responsibility. You have to delegate authority to the 50 states. Mm-hmm. That's why, all 50 states use electronic voting of some form. Some have Arkansas's got a lot of backups. Other states may not have as many, but they do have some kind. But, a lot of these countries who have better turnout and more universal laws and stuff like that are smaller countries. I'm thinking like England. You get, it's a country, give or take, the size of Florida or the size of California. They're going to have it's easy for them to say everybody uses the same rule set. Whereas, the U.S., having the same thing work for like a North Dakota election that does a Florida election would just be really difficult. Different volumes of, voters and polling places and stuff like that. I will say one of the things that's interesting about this election is we may have finally broken our political turnout funk. As passionate as people have been about politics for the last, since the millennia, since 2000, we were always stuck at like, 59% turnout, 60% turnout. I looked it up yesterday. We probably broke 67% turnout, absolutely like crushing old records of how many people showed up to actually cast votes. And that was, it's still counting, those California counties are still figuring out how many people voted and totaling them up. But I think it's always about trying to improve the system, make it a little better, a little accurate, a little more, a little faster. And like, Marie brought up, different states are going to have different things they got to figure out. North Carolina has to figure out military voting. And Texas, California have to deal with that as well. Alaska, I'm trying to think, Alaska and Oregon use they've done all their elections through the mail. Because, Alaska, it's Alaska. Yeah. So it'll be, if you really want an interesting question, is what will the 2024 election look like when we don't have COVID, when we've expanded the availability of voting? How much of that will stay? Will you get more early voting? Will you get more permissible absentee votes? That's what, to a political scientist, that's what we're, sort of nerding out about next, is that, they made it easier to vote because of the pandemic in 2020 in basically every state. And hey, all of a sudden turnout jumps by 6, 7, 8%. We joke about, you got to find silver linings. That's a pretty good silver lining. And the question will be, will that stay for 2024 and beyond?
Do you think there's things, this is kind of thought provoking, but do you think there's things that we can do for the future to increase voter turnout? Like, not necessarily fine people $400 or $500, but it does seem like that is something that's come up. Is I've heard people pushing for, like, hey, you turn 18, you're automatically registered to vote. You don't have to go through anything. And one of these questions we already really addressed it, I feel like, was talking about uniform election laws or federal run elections. What about like a uniform system of you are registered to vote because you're a citizen? There's no process or mail in, or you're just automatically registered. Would that answer any questions? What are you guys' thoughts on that?
Marie?
Do you want to answer that from the political scientist?
Well, I was going to let you go first because I just rambled for a while.
Okay. I think that same-day voter registration, pouring money into making elections easier, having expanded mail-in ballots. I mean, obviously, if voting is more accessible, more people are going to vote. I mean, even during a pandemic, you have this drastic increase in voter turnout. And that's in a large part due to the fact that you had more mail-in voting, that it was more accessible for people. And same-day registration is important. Just informing voters about when's the last day to register, here's the different ways you can vote. Pouring money into those kind of campaigns would be important. So there are lots of things that we can continue to do, and that activists have been doing for years and years to make more people turn out. But I think that the mail-in voting thing is probably the biggest, and making it more accessible. Mm-hmm. But the turnout excites me as a political historian too, because I'm going to be able to use all that data that you put into to different ways that I can actually use it for my research later. So I'm excited about having all this data from this massive turnout too.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. Do you want to add anything to that, Housenick, before we move on?
No, I think that covers it. Like Marie said, a lot of the early voting, mail-in voting. I mean, that's what this is not a new thing. They've been trying to get voter turnout up since the 70s. When they lower the voting age from 21 to 18, that should help turnout. But we've been stuck in this kind of 59 and 60% funk for years. And all of a sudden, with everything we did this year, it just seems we've broken out of that. But it's like, what lessons will we continue to carry forward of that from now on will be interesting.
Right.
All right. Next, this is from Megan Ford. I think perhaps a friend of yours. All right. How can we, Arkansans, help or get involved in the Georgia Senate runoff race?
So this is very exciting. We're about to see the most expensive Senate race in U.S. history. At least $1 billion are going to pour into Georgia for this Senate race, because the control of the Senate hinges on this election in Georgia. And so there are lots of different ways you can get involved. I don't know how you can get involved if you're a Republican and want to help the Republicans win this election. But if you are a Democrat and you want to help Warnock or Ossoff win this election, then you can go to fairfightaction.com and you can work with Stacey Abrams' group. She is a force to be reckoned with in American politics and is on the ground mobilizing people in Georgia, getting out the vote in Georgia. And I think that that's probably the most realistic way to help. They don't need volunteers to rush into, or any more volunteers to rush into the state right now. But you can sign up to phone bank, you can sign up to, and I'm sure that that's the same is true on the Republican side as well. I'm sure that they need phone bankers, and they need people writing postcards, and they need people making texting as well. But I know through Fair Fight Action, if you want the Democrats to win, then you can go to that. And I'm sure that the information on the Republican side is easily available with a quick Google search, but I don't have that information on hand.
Yeah,
I'm very excited about that.
It's going to definitely be the most. It will absolutely be the most expensive runoff election ever.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You're probably right though. As crazy as this year has been, the most expensive election ever. There was a California Senate seat where they spent $250 million. This is it was Carly Fiorina years ago, but she lost. But that was an entire normal election cycle. Yeah, my biggest thing.
Runoff. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's going to be, will they $200 million in 2 months?
It's going to be wild.
Oh, good.
Dang, wow.
Yes.
All right. Here's an interesting. Marie, you might have some perspective on this. I'm sure. Do people of color influence the election? And if so, to what degree? And who would you say was the average voter in the 2016 election versus the 2020 election?
Well, Americans of color certainly do impact election results. There's lots of great examples from this election, but a couple of examples are Arizona. Native Americans in Arizona, almost 9-1, voted in record numbers for the Democratic ticket. And so that helped put Joe Biden and Mark Kelly over the top in Arizona. So those are Americans of color who are changing election results. Black women in Georgia, 9-1, the Democratic ticket showed up in record numbers. So that helped when those elections come down to less than 20,000 votes, turnout matters. And those groups are turning out right now. Same in Detroit and Michigan, same in Pennsylvania. So when those races are tight, even if nationally they don't make up a majority of the electorate, in those states where it matters, if people of color are turning out, then they absolutely change the results of the election.
And you hit that on the head, because she asked another question later on about, and do you think this is what contributed to Georgia and Arizona flipping?
I think there was a lot of amazing organization on the ground, but yes, it's those groups of voters. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the only thing everybody like Joe Biden beat Donald Trump, but Joe Biden actually more accurately, I think, beat Hillary Clinton. Because that in the aftermath of 2016, one of the biggest problems, Hillary Clinton did not attract as many Hispanic voters. It was basically Hispanic voting has gone up as a percentage of the Democratic Party about 1% every 4 years. She maintained, but it dropped from the Obama runs to Hillary Clinton. African Americans, now they didn't go vote for Trump. They stayed home.
Right.
And when they stay home, you see states like Pennsylvania, that's the one they bring up in particular. They stayed home, and it cost Hillary Clinton that election. And I think Joe Biden knew in this campaign, he's got to get everybody in his party out to the polls. And that's why you see such a big swing in, like, Michigan is the biggest one. Pennsylvania's in the same ballpark, big as well, but he was able to fix what Hillary Clinton failed at in 2016, which was mobilize important blocks of his party, especially people of color.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's another one. And Housenick and I actually did an entire episode on this, basically talking about changing American voting behavior in the Electoral College. But another question from Abby. what would happen if we got rid of the Electoral College? And I shared that podcast on this thread, so she can watch it. We talked about that a little, but any insight on that?
The one I've got is politics is a set of rules, and you strategize according to the rule set. My class example I always use, everybody's played Monopoly, right? Every time you go to play at somebody's house, people have different rule sets. Do you put $500 in the middle of the board?
You definitely do.
Do you have to go around the board once before you start buying property? Do you actually use the auction rule? You land on a space, you don't want to buy it, it goes to auction. Whenever you set up a rule set, people read the rules and play the game according to the rules. I don't know if you would get a better or worse or different result, but you would have a different kind of campaign. You know, the big one is because every single vote matters everywhere. In Arkansas, we got a lot of campaign commercials, but we didn't get as many as the swing states. You know, my parents and my in-laws are all from Pennsylvania, and they have had Joe Biden and Donald Trump commercials on the air for 6 straight months, every commercial break. Yeah, but you know, we only get them nationally if you're watching something. If you went to a nationwide popular vote, every vote for everywhere would matter. So you would have to have things like the Trump campaign would have had a campaign in California. You know, it would have made sense to put in more money there. And likewise, the Biden campaign would have had to spend money in Alabama, Mississippi, because if they can up the votes there, they get more popular votes. But the campaigns would tailor strategies to this. You know, as I said, Monopoly is the one everybody knows. You see this in sports. You know, different jiu-jitsu rule sets. This is legal. That's legal. This is, you know, people are going to read the rules. And they're going to play the game according to the rule set. So there's no such thing as fair or unfair because you change your mindset, you change your strategy. But to get rid of the Electoral College also requires a constitutional amendment. And I think Marie could say how rarely that has happened after the Bill of Rights.
Yes. Yeah, you're absolutely right that we don't know what would happen because it would be a completely different campaign. The political landscape would look completely differently.
Okay. Another question here. And Marie and I have talked about this in the past, at least in passing, and it's a fascinating topic. When did the South stop being blue dog Democrats, and is the Democratic Party dead in Arkansas?
So this is what I basically, in a large part, write my dissertation on, is the changing politics in the South. And so the switch in the Democratic, you can go back further than this, but I start with 1948, with the election of 1948, when the Southern Democrats walk out of the Democratic National Convention and form the Dixiecrat Party. So Southern Democrats in the South, they're the party of the Civil War. It's the Southern Democrats that vote to secede across the South. During Reconstruction, many of them are not allowed to vote. So you have Republicans in the South during Reconstruction. And then after Reconstruction ends, you have the Democratic Party once again coming to power through the Redeemers, those white men who favored disfranchisement of Black voters and favored Jim Crow. And they were coming back into power in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. And so the South really is a Democratic bloc from that period on. So it's primary elections in the South that matter during those years. It's not the general election because you know the Democrat's going to win. That changes in 1948 in the general election when you have President Truman comes out with a party platform or a plank in the party platform for civil rights. He's got these 10 civil rights proposals, and that fall in 1948, they're added to the Democratic platform. So the Southern Democrats are part of the Southern Democrats walkout. They form a third party, the Dixiecrats, and some of the Southern states vote for the Dixiecratic ticket instead of the Democratic ticket. Now they're going to go back to the Democratic Party for a while, but then in 1968, Southern Democrats completely turned to the Republican Party, because by 1968, the Republican Party has become the party of conservatism in the country. So you have 1964, you had Goldwater, ultra conservative. Now he doesn't win. Johnson wins that election overwhelmingly, but he's won in that primary against a more liberal conservative in Nelson Rockefeller, or a liberal Republican in Nelson Rockefeller. So the conservatives begin to take over the Republican Party at that point. And in 1968, Southerners vote for Nixon. They vote for the Republican Party. And so it's at that point that Southerners begin to become Republican rather than conservative. Now you're going to see back and forth, from 1968 on. It's not going to be completely a solid Republican, but that's when that starts. Is you see the first cracks in 1948, and then that switch made pretty much in 1968. And the other part of that question, I think, was, is the Democratic Party dead in Arkansas? And Arkansas, I mean, Tom Cotton was only elected 6 years ago in 2014. We had a Democratic senator until 2014. So that's fairly recent. Now, I do think, and I'm sure I'm not the best one to speak on this, but Arkansas went fairly red. I mean, pretty far to the right in this election. And there are a lot of issues with the state Democratic Party. But I don't think that we should just say that Arkansas Democrats are completely boxed out in Arkansas elections. The demographics are there for the Democratic Party to win elections in Arkansas.
Yeah, everything we call in political science, we call it Southern realignment, but it's a lot of the electoral, when we talk about national trends, you've got this election that blows the old system out of the water and you get a new one. It's really hard to get this across to students, but it's this combination of Southern realignment, because like you say, it happens in different states at different rates.
Yeah.
I think it was like Georgia and Alabama were earlier in that process than Arkansas was. But part of it too is when you want to go to the later parts, a big element was a combination of Roe versus Wade and then the rise of Reagan Republicanism. Yeah. Because those two things are really, the Republican Party of today is still, at least at its core, the party of what Reagan built starting throughout the 1980s. Conservative, Christian event, the more religious forward party, if you want to go full circle from our beginning. But a lot of that happens, like you said, different states at different rates. I don't encourage students to do this normally, but if you go to Wikipedia, start scrolling through Arkansas's governors. They do these great graphs where they show you who's in charge, and it's blue if it's Democrat and it's red if it's Republican. And they do the same thing, governors, legislatures, House members, senators. And you start scrolling Arkansas, you're going to realize it's like 80% blue. Yep. And you get these little splotches of red every once in a while. But in political science, when we talk about Southern realignment, Arkansas is like the last Southern state. And we only attribute it at 2010. That is where Pryor loses re-election. Wait, no, not quite. But that's where all the House seats flip. That is where the woman senator, Blanche Lincoln, that's where she loses in her re-election campaign. Just right across the board, all these Democratic races in Arkansas, some of these became Republican, and staunchly Republican. Now, part of it is I think the Democrats are in trouble because part of what has happened, this is where you brought up Stacey Abrams is like the Democratic darling. She has done what Democrats needed to do, and it's organize. She is a genius. She handed Georgia to Biden.
Yes.
She got volunteers. She got people knocking on doors in a pandemic. What happened in Arkansas is you had the Clinton network. When Bill Clinton was running for governor, when he was in his presidential campaigns, Arkansas was still, it was conservative Democrat. It was that, the blue dog Democrat, if I'm got my terminology right, but he had campaign networks in the state. Once Bill is left politics, those kind of founder, they help a little bit for Hillary to win, the Arkansas delegation to get the nomination, but they don't get her, she doesn't win Arkansas. And what has happened now is basically the Clinton networks have gone. They've fallen apart. And libertarians and Democrats are trying to build these networks. Now, some places they're easier to build than others. Like you're seeing a lot of like that 2nd congressional district, that Pulaski County. It's close together. It's urban. It's easier to build up. Northwest Arkansas, like you say, you've got some of those networks. For the Democrats, it's down in the Delta, down in Southeast Arkansas. They've got a pretty good stronghold in the African-American communities down there. But if you want to win in Arkansas, you're going to need the whole state. And that is part of the problem. You don't have those networks. I think, Democrats right now could make it closer than it really is. I think Tom Cotton won, but he ran against a libertarian, not a Democrat. He won 2/3, 60, I think 66-33, 2/3, 1/3. But the Republicans in Arkansas have a great network built. If you want to beat that network, you got to build your own. And I think that's the problem you're running into for Democrats. But it's not sexy work. It's not flamboyant work. It's grinding out, finding people in every county who's going to go knock on doors, who's going to get, yelled at and stuff thrown in him or her. And but it's what wins elections. That's part of, I will say I've been reading a lot about Stacey Abrams, and she was grinding at this for like 18 months.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I think Brian can point to it. Americans tend to be impatient. I want it now, just like our election results. But she put in 18 months of hard work getting people registered, getting them through the primaries, getting them to the polls. You need that same kind of organizational effort in Arkansas because there are populations who are unrepresented. In here in Russellville, Dardanelle, there's massive Hispanic populations. We don't see them running for city councils. We don't see them mentioned at all. There is a lot of people out there who are just kind of sitting by the wayside. But if you want to bring them into politics, whether it's local or state, you got to start getting out there, knocking on doors, going to those, parts of town that you may not be familiar with, and really start putting in that kind of time and effort. And, for whatever reason, to this point, the Democrats in Arkansas just haven't put in the time, the money, the effort, besides that 2nd congressional district around Little Rock.
Yeah.
So.
Do you want to add anything to that, Marie?
No, I think that covered it.
Cool. So we got 2 more questions, a couple of minutes left. Is the current administration stopping the transfer of power? And if so, how dangerous can that be?
Well, first of all, he doesn't have to concede. There's nothing in the Constitution that says concession is necessary for the transfer of power. There are things that the current administration are doing to block the transfer of classified information and office space and money to the Biden transition team, which can be a detriment. In the 9/11 report, they cited a shorter transition period for the Bush 43 to come into office as one of the reasons, one of many reasons for the 9/11 terror attacks. And so if you look at that information, then yeah, that could be a detriment in slowing down this process. But the Biden team has said explicitly that they are moving forward. Joe Biden doesn't need a tour of the White House. He doesn't need, he's got that down. He's got really experienced people in positions of power that are ready to go on day one. I think it's a detriment, but I think it absolutely could be worse. And the concession is not necessary.
Yeah. I think the formal process will be forced open December 1st, because part of it is basically, I think only like half a dozen states have certified their elections. What the official, there's an office whose name I can't remember at this point. They're the ones who determine whether or not to engage in this transition. And they base their decision off of the official certified elections. The minute you have 270 electoral college votes certified for Joe Biden, they open the doors. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's either right before Thanksgiving or at latest the Monday after Thanksgiving, where all this sort of him and hawn ends, where people start to be legally, you start to get all the whatever cooperation is available. That's a whole nother animal to discuss on another podcast. I think one of the things about the Trump administration is there's a lot of acting people. Yeah. Acting, like right now, there's an acting Secretary of Defense. That makes transitioning a little bit weird, to put it mildly. President Trump's been hard on his bureaucrats, I think, is a good assessment. And there's just not a lot of people to transition from and to. So I think that's going to be one of the things going forward. But I think you still got about 2 more weeks. So as I glance at my calendar, he's not obstructing anything legally yet. But the minute you have 270 certified Biden Electoral College votes, they're going to have to open up. They're going to have to work, or that's where you start getting into the intentional destruction, the intentional infliction of national security crises. And yeah, Marie got the big one. They study a lot of this for 2000, and that was just because the election mucked it up. You're sitting around waiting for recounts and all that sort of stuff. It definitely creates a lot of problems.
Yeah. Last question here, and I think we've hit on most of this, and I will say for people that are listening to this that posed questions in like the more local audience, some of the questions I felt like we addressed already. We didn't go back into them, right? But here's one. We've at least hit on some of this. What's the actual prevalence of election fraud in U.S. elections in general? And why the red to blue shift between election day and when mail/absentee ballots were counted, and why such a partisan break with these ballots this cycle?
This is another question a lot of my students asked me this week, and I think there may be more here, but the president said on the campaign trail that mail-in ballot voting was fraud and not to use it. And so his voters didn't, and they voted in person. The Democratic Party had a pretty good, here's how you mail-in vote. You drop it off at the election. You drop it off by this point. They were flooding social media with this information. And so I don't think it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that more Democrats voted by mail. And the reason that it's going back to our earlier discussion of Pennsylvania, the reason that it looks like it's such a skew is because same-day votes were counted first in some places, and mail-in voting was counted second in some places. And so it's an artificial thing that the media created.
Yeah. Yeah, I even saw a meme alluding to that. They're like, this whole base was encouraged to not do this.
Right. And so they didn't do it. Now they showed up in record numbers. I mean, their turnout was huge, just like the Democratic Party's turnout was huge, but they went in person. They didn't vote by mail because the leader of their party said not to.
Yeah. You would say that this is going to be one of the things that political science talks about, is that as good as Donald Trump's turnout was, he probably still depressed it even some more.
Yeah.
And I would think like Georgia, he probably cost himself the race because he says, well, this is fraudulent, this is fake. So he, all it takes is, 5,000 people to go, oh yeah, I'm going to, follow this presidential tweet and not show, not going to mail my ballot in. And it cost him a state. Yeah. And it would have been a closer race.
And Republican operatives were warning about this. Florida had a whole campaign telling its people to vote by mail because it has such an older population. And so my in-laws are in South Florida, and they were told to vote by mail over and over and over again because you don't want to depress turnout. So he was warned that this would depress turnout. But
and he won Florida. He won Florida cleanly. Florida got it right, and a reasonable amount of time. When Florida man cannot be made fun of, something's up. So
yeah, they learned a big lesson from 2000.
And if you want to know more about Florida, you listen to the recent History Unraveled episode with Dr. Totten, Eric Totten.
Yeah.
He went into his research at St. Augustine, which I thought was awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you guys have anything further to add? Closing comments? I think we had a lot of great questions. I was really happy. That was a great idea to throw that out there, Housenick, and I was trying to pump it over the last couple of days. That's everyday people that we know that have questions. And I thought that was super informative.
Well, I think they go just best places to find info. I always look multiple places. I'll admit it, on election night, I had Fox News in my browser in the back. Because if Fox News tells Donald Trump you lost. Sorry. It's one of those things like, does the media have bias? Yeah, sure. But you can use that bias to your advantage when, your own party tells your candidate you lost. Somebody also brought up polling. If you want to go deep dive and lose yourself for a couple of weeks, my favorite polling website's a guy by the name of Nate Silver, 538.com.
Yeah.
That's all he does is polling. He is a stats nerd, but he's one of the most accurate guys. He talks about he goes into the science behind it, the figuring out what's going on. And, the polls were accurate enough this time around. Yeah, they're never perfect. But polls also are the most inaccurate when you need them the most. If you got a 50-50 race, they're going to struggle to tell you who's going to win. If you're getting blown out of the water, you don't really need a poll to say, you're going to get 5 votes and your mom's one of them. When you get lose 4 million to 5, but he covers a lot of it. That to me in the last, I'd say 3 or 4 weeks was sort of standard. They do a nice little podcast. They got their round tables and stuff like that. They'll explain what they're, you'll understand sampling and all that kind of good stuff. They really get under the hood so you understand it better in a way that most people can grasp.
Yes, the 538 podcast is excellent.
Yeah.
And the latest podcast where he talks about how the polls weren't that wrong, and he creates a forecast of he averages all of the polls. But one thing I found interesting about the polling is that Biden's internal polling was not that off. He knew where the race would come down to. He was in Pennsylvania a lot the last week or so of the election, and he knew it was going to be close. He knew it would come down to mail-in ballots. So his internal polls were not as off as the public national polls. And you're right, the national polls weren't. Yeah, okay, there's an outlier here or there that says Wisconsin Biden's up by 17 points, but that's an outlier. That's not an average of all the polls. The news sources question I thought was really great, and just to hit on that a little bit, I think people today are confused. You don't have to like the news. I saw all these people, fans of Fox News, who are leaving Fox News. You don't have to be a fan of your news. The news isn't there to entertain you. It's there to give you information. And so I think people think that when they disagree with the news, that somehow it's bias. But that's not how news works. That's not how facts work. Mm-hmm. So you can be a fan of an opinion host, but that's opinion. The editorial side of things are different than the news side of things. Mm-hmm. And so like the New York editorial board is different or the New York Times editorial board is different than the New York Times news page. And so I do think there's a lot of media illiteracy, and I think that that's probably a whole other podcast that you should probably think about. But one of those two things really strike me is all the fans of Fox News that I'm seeing lately who are leaving. You don't have to be a fan of your news.
Well, I think that's true. That's absolutely true. What you brought up for all news sources, most of what you see, whether it's CNN, whether it's Fox, you're not actually watching a news broadcast. You are watching the opinion pages come to life.
Right.
Go watch. I don't know if they still do. There used to be CNN headline news.
Yeah.
Every 30 minutes, it's almost the same thing. They just cycle through it. That was what real news looks like.
Right.
And you get only these little, like this 1 hour here or 30 minutes there in your major. It's talk shows. It's opinions.
Right. When there's a panel, that's a talk show.
Yes.
Those are pundits who are giving you their opinion, which I find interesting and I love listening to them. But I understand, that that's not blanket news. Like, get your news from AP or Reuters or Axios, the news side of those sites.
But I think you were exactly right, though, Marie. Not enough people know that they don't know and can't differentiate that. It's clear in newspapers,
right.
When you hit the opinion page, but there should be almost like a tag somewhere on the screen. Although it'd be up all the time somewhere. This is the opinion page of, CNN or whomever it might be.
Well, it sounds like we might have ourselves some future Politics Unraveled episodes. Again, it's been a great idea for Marie, and anytime either of you, Housenick had the idea to do the electoral electoral college podcast last time. So you guys hit me up anytime you want to do it again. It's been awesome.
Well, if they ever figured out what the casino is going on around here. I mean, hey, we made it almost 100 minutes without the bringing up the casinos in Pope County. Come on. Or the 1 cent sales tax.
Yeah. Well, right on. Well, thanks, guys. I'll tag you and share it over when I get this uploaded. I'm going to try and get it uploaded and get it out kind of quickly just because I'm excited about it. So, tomorrow or the next day is my plan. So,
sweet.
All right. Thanks, guys. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks.
Bye.
See ya.